Marsh was victorious. It didn't feel quite as nice as he thought it would. The blood staining his canines made him feel sick to his stomach, his nose curling in disgust. He didn't just feel disgusted by the body lying at his feet, he realized. He felt disgusted by himself. There was no going back. Earlier. Wake up, brother. Despite the familiar term of address, the voice cut through the still humidity of a too-small cave with calculating indifference. The naive wolf on the receiving end either didn't notice or didn't care as he was nudged to his feet by his elder. It's time. The stranger was a relatively large wolf for his species, but he was still smaller than the 7-month-old Marsh. Timberwolves, such as himself, didn't belong among the grasslands of Africa, and yet he was here. Even though he was small for his age and species, he still had several pounds over the older Ethiopian wolf before him. Marsh's naivety, however, prevented his size from seeming intimidating. Instead, he opened wide eyes to face the other wolf, blinking confusedly, before suddenly the memories of last night seemed to rush back to him. His month-long search for home. The strange wolves who promised him he was close, led him to unfamiliar lands and faced him with an intimidating wolf with a jagged scar across his left eye. The fight. His body ached just thinking about it, and then nothing. He couldn't recall anything after that, but the way his muscles ached told him he wasn't just weary from his travels. He'd lost, that much was certain. The stranger waited for him to catch up impatiently, and when understanding reached the younger's eyes, he didn't give him time to ask questions before he asserted, "Follow me." Marsh seemed a bit put off, before he nodded briefly, following after the other male with a slight limp to his step. He must have injured his paw in the fight. He was led out of the shade of the cave and into blistering heat, and he silently cursed his winter coat for its existence. Here in the dry season of Africa, it was only a nuisance. He crossed paths with several wolves bickering over a bone, and each one turned to stare at him eerily as they passed. The sun was only just beginning to rise over the horizon, vibrant hues of gold and crimson coloring the sky. All the wolves here were scrawny, made of skin and bone and fur and not much else. He noticed after a moment that most of the wolves were headed in the same direction they were, towards a large clearing where the thatch grass had been trampled repeatedly. He was led by the older wolf into the center of a clearing, around which crowded what must have been almost the whole pack. He yelped as he stepped on something sharp, picking up his paw to find the broken piece of fang, distinctly wolf in nature, beneath it. His stomach turned. He realized with a start that the wolf that led him here was gone, having disappeared into the crowd, leaving him alone in the clearing. All eyes were on him, and even he could sense the bloodlust in the air. Then, a she-wolf was pushed into the clearing across from him, seeming just as frightened and small as he felt. She looked emaciated, her ribcage painfully visible through her tight skin. He knew he probably wasn't in any better condition. "Brothers and sisters, we gather you here today to celebrate the reign of Alpha Tar, who has given us food and shelter in our time of need." The voice of a third wolf standing at the edge of the clearing was almost drowned out by the cheering and howling of the crowd. He was notably better fed than the rest of the crowd, and young Marsh could only assume that he was in a position of high authority. Despite the exuberant cheering, he thought he could hear a few scoffs within the crowd as well. The wolf waited for the crowd to quiet before he continued. "Alpha Tar has ensured our safety for many years through his arena, designed to strike fear in the hearts of our enemies." The wolf's words were met with roaring approval, and Marsh resisted the urge to cover his ears. They spoke of Tar as if he were some sort of messiah, but even the young Marsh could see that his pack was hardly well-fed or safe in these lands. "I won't keep you waiting any longer," the wolf yelled over the crowd. "Let the fight to the death begin!" Suddenly, everything seemed to click in Marsh's head, and his eyes snapped towards the she-wolf. Their gazes met, and he could smell the fear radiating off the female. He took several steps back, his hackles rising as he realized the danger he was in. The she-wolf seemed conflicted, her eyes swimming as she glanced back and forth from Marsh to the large wolf on the sidelines. Eventually, her eyes set on the larger wolf, and she growled threateningly, insisting, "I won't fight a pup!" Marsh's eyes widened as she faced off against the larger wolf, even as he backed away further towards the edge of the clearing. Someone from the crowd nipped at his ankle and he yelped, moving a few steps closer to the center. There was no escape. He was surrounded by the bloodthirsty crowd. "Then you refuse to fight?" the other wolf asked, his voice eerily calm. Something within the she-wolf hesitated in her resolve. She sensed the threat behind those words. Marsh knew even before she said it that she had resigned herself to obedience. She turned back towards Mars, piercing him with amber eyes. "I'm sorry, young un. I have a pack to return to." Several laughs arose in the crowd, but the she-wolf did not address them, circling around the field. Marsh moved with her across the clearing, fear shining in his young eyes. Then it began. The she-wolf made the first move. She lunged for him, teeth glinting in the rising sun with a threatening growl. Marsh didn't have time to think. He stumbled out of the way, tripping over his injured paw, and what had started as a sidestep turned into a roll. He recovered, wheeling around on his heel, muscles burning with the effort. He barely had time to process before he was knocked off his paws, lying on his back with the she-wolf on top of him, only held back from ripping out his throat by his paws on her chest, pushing her away with all the strength he had. "We don't have to fight, sister!" he shouted over her snarls, adrenaline pumping through his system. It was no use. She did not relent. He wondered if this was the end, and before he realized it, his struggles lessened. Then the she-wolf slipped up. Maybe he was overconfident now that he seemed to be giving up, or maybe Marsh's luck was finally looking up. It didn't matter. She left a split-second opening in her defense just before she moved to make what would have been a killing blow. He didn't waste his time in taking the opportunity. He kicked out with his back paws at the last second possible, just before her yellowed fangs reached his throat. She froze as his kick made contact with her underside, and for a moment, Marsh didn't understand why. He hadn't hit her hard enough to really hurt her. He was sure he'd wasted the one opportunity he had been given. Then, in a moment of horror, it seemed so still that time had stopped. He realized what he had before. Her stomach, although still skin and bones, held a slight curvature to it, signature of a wolf in the early stages of pregnancy. Having never seen a pregnant wolf before, he hadn't noticed until now, but something about the way the wolves on the sideline were looking at him told him they knew what he had just done. Slowly, time began to move again. He rolled out from under her grip, which had loosened significantly in the she-wolf's shock, but he barely had time to get to her feet before her eyes turned sharp with maternal protectiveness. There was a flurry of attacks Marsh could barely keep up with, attacks he wasn't sure he wanted to keep up with. His mind was swimming with thoughts of, what have I done? And I've killed her pups. And he considered that perhaps it would be better if he just let her kill him. However, his body moved on its own, determined to survive even if his mind wasn't so sure. The wolves on the sidelines let out jeering howls, clearly enjoying the show. Realization struck him with all the intensity of a thunderbolt. Even if one of them won, they wouldn't be going home. Their fate was grim no matter what the result of this fight was. Something inside Marsh snapped. "You want a monster? I'll give you one." With a ferocious snarl that didn't sound right coming out of a 7-month-old, he lunged forward, his inhibitions forgotten. He missed the throat he had been aiming at, his fangs instead crunching down on the bones of her leg. He heard a sickening crunch, and iron tainted his mouth, the howl of pain from the she-wolf sounding muffled by distance. He didn't let go until he felt her fangs bite into his shoulder, pain blossoming from the spot as he felt blood turn his fur slick. He released her, and she released him in turn, both assessing their own wounds even as it didn't let the other outside of their sights. Blood stained his sides, staining his long winter coat with crimson, and his paw was still sore from the fight with the alpha. He could barely walk on it now, the pain in his shoulder compounding with the sprained joint in his paw. The she-wolf didn't look much better off, however, the bone sticking out from her leg at a sharp angle, clearly broken. Even if she escaped, she'd likely never walk properly again. Something like regret tugged at Marsh's soul, but he ignored it, adrenaline pulsing through his veins. The look in her eyes was something wild, something so desperate he couldn't compare it to anything else. Something had overtaken Marsh, the kind of something that slithers into your soul and eats away at your insides. The kind of something that let him justify the taking of a life. The sky darkened and lightning cracked through the air in the beginnings of a dry storm, thunder following soon after, as if the heavens themselves were quaking in anticipation for their next move. The wolves on the sideline were enraptured, their eyes riveted to the fight before them. It was the beginning of the end. They both moved at the same instant, each focused on nothing else but this moment. They met in the middle of a clearing, their savage faces illuminated by another flash of lightning, before it became a mess of blood and teeth. They both stood on their hind legs, their paws flinging wildly in search of a break in the other's defense, teeth snapping and growls raising. In another flash, they were rolling through the clearing, and the crowd parted to avoid their flying fangs. The two wolves on the ground barely noticed, too wrapped up in the intensity of a fight for their life. Exhilaration flooded through Marsh as he landed on top, some stroke of luck allowing him mercy. He placed a paw on the throat of the older wolf beneath him, cutting off her airflow. She writhed underneath him, her amber orbs reflecting his form as lightning sliced through the eye behind him. I look like a monster. Realization at what he was doing flooded through him, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. Unable to look into those eyes and his reflection within any longer, he leaned down and wrapped his fangs around her throat, ripping out flesh and fur. She gaped for a moment, a wild look entering her eyes as she realized she couldn't breathe through the hole in her throat. Then she went still and her eyes glossed over. She stared at her for a long moment, just to make sure she was dead. Then the crowd howled and cheered, the sound drowned out by the thunder over their heads. Marsh was victorious. It didn't feel quite as nice as he thought it would. The blood staining his canines made him feel sick to his stomach, his nose curling in disgust. He didn't just feel disgusted by the body lying at his feet, he realized. He felt disgusted by himself. There was no going back.